Well, considered the strongest, most sensitive, and most flexible muscle in the human body, the human tongue is bizarrely wonderful. It contains 10,000 taste buds and 150,000 nerves that all send messages to the brain to interpret and for us to enjoy all manner of variety of tastes and textures. It is normally true that men have longer tongues than women, but it is also true that women use the tongue more frequently than men. Women, by average, speak 20,000 words a day, while men only speak around 7,000. This means after 1 year, women on average will speak 7.3 million words, while men only speak 2.5 million words. That's a difference of 4.8 million words, which is the equivalent of reading the whole of War and Peace 8 times. It would take, on average, the normal male 3 years to speak as much as a woman does in one. No wonder the problem with men and women is so often communication. Ladies, you talk too much. Men, you don't talk at all. With our tongues, we taste, talk, swallow, lick, smack, spit, or stick them out. With it, we can encourage or inflict. We can raise an army to war, or we can rebuke someone in the wrong. We can comfort the hopeless and confront the rebellious. With the tongue, we can wage war or woo that special someone. So Proverbs 18 is spot on when it says, life and death are in the power of the tongue. We know this to be true. Perhaps this is one of the many reasons why of all the things that are available in the mind and heart of Christ to teach on in the Sermon on the Mount, choices had to be made. He chose to speak, in our passage today, on our speech. This is our text today. This is what's in view, our speech. Matthew 5:33 to 37, on the topic of oaths and vows. Something that you might immediately think does not have any type of supreme significance or relevance for our lives today. You're like, what is going on here? Like, we don't do this. But I would push back and say, we do this far more than we are aware of just in common cultural lingo. And even if we don't think it's immediately relevant, which we're wrong, it is, we must remember Jesus chose to teach on this. It's included in the Sermon on the Mount, therefore it deserves our utmost attention. So 2 headings today to work through, verse 33 to 37. First, see just in verse 33, the perversion of the Jews. Verse 33, Jesus says, "Again you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn." As we begin here and launch out in verse 33, we must remember what Jesus is doing. I've said this every time so far since we've gotten to chapter 5, verse 17, because there we read the verse that colors our whole interpretation and meaning of the rest of chapter 5 and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus came not to abolish, not to destroy, but to fulfill the law and the prophets, the Old Testament. He came to bring it to its intended completion. We saw that, we've seen that so far as Jesus taught on murder and anger, lust and adultery, divorce And I think, even though we don't think perhaps this just launches off the page to us today, we come to a text where this is probably more clearly seen than we've seen so far. Why? Because you can't go to the Old Testament and find verse 33. You won't find the exact quote or words or phrase that Jesus is using in verse 33 in the Old Testament. That lets us know what Jesus is doing. He's not comparing the Old Testament, like that's wrong, with his new teaching, like God used to say this, but now it's changed. Now I say to you this. No. What is he quoting? He's quoting the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees. Their false interpretation that led to false practice, their perversion of a good principle, that's what he's quoting. And that's what he intends to correct in this passage. Now, while you can't find this teaching anywhere in the Old Testament, you will find familiar sayings on this teaching in the Old Testament that kind of formed and filled out the understanding of first century Judaism. So, for example, such passages as Exodus 20, verse 7, the third commandment, which says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." The ninth commandment is also in view here, Exodus 20:16. "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." Leviticus 19:12. "You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." Numbers chapter 30, verse 2. "If a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." And Deuteronomy 6, verse 12 and 13 was sure to make an appearance in the understanding of the scribes and Pharisees. It says, "Take care lest you forget the Lord." That phrase is a sermon in and of itself. "Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is the Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear." From this, I think we can see that an oath or a vow, they're similar entities. Simply put, they have three elements to them. First, an oath or a vow begins with a bare statement of truth. Second, after such truth is stated, there's a call to God or to a greater party to bear witness to, confirm, attest to the validity of said truth. And third, concluding the oath or vow is some kind of action, penalty, or consequence that's demanded that not only bears witness to the two former realities, but what happens if lines are crossed in this binding agreement. We know what this is. I mean, how often have you yourself said, and this is the cultural lingo, "I swear to God," and then fill in the blank. Like, "I swear to God I saw an alien." Or, I mean, that's just an example, right? That's the example that came out this morning with us. Or maybe you've heard that, or maybe you've been to court and you've had to place your hand on a Bible, or you were just a witness testifying in some other court case between other people, and you just sat down and the judge looked at you and like, "Do you swear to tell the truth?" And we're like, "I swear, so help me God." This is normal cultural lingo for us, and it was not very different for this first century Jewish crowd that Jesus is dealing with here in Matthew 5. They had indeed read and studied all those Old Testament passages and more that we have just worked through. And those scriptures certainly formed and filled out their understanding of what God required in oaths and vows. And so, verse 33 is their understanding. Jesus gives it to us that one who swears, one who makes an oath or a vow, should not swear falsely, but should perform to the Lord what has been sworn. Maybe at first glance you're like, what's wrong with that? It all sounds well and good, doesn't it? And you'd be right. This is a good principle on the surface, but herein lies the trouble. What began as a good practice over time devolved into something perverted. The making of oaths and vows look on the surface as something that's entirely righteous because they're filled with sacred words. Yet by the time Jesus is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, all these oaths and vows are not intended to just be used on rare, serious, sacred, and solemn occasions. They're used to hide sin, to lie, and to deceive one another. That's what these things are used for. It was a common belief among Jews of this time that an oath or a vow between two men, a man and a man, really didn't matter at all because it's not between man and God. And so if I break this, whatever language is used, I'm guilt-free because God's not involved. Others would think that they're guilt-free if they don't bring into the oath or vow the very divine name of God. They think, I'm not going to mention it, therefore, because I don't mention it, God is not in view, and I can just kind of do whatever I want to do. So while oaths and vows are good, were encouraged in many places throughout the Old Testament for rare, solemn, sacred, and serious occasions, people began using them for anything and everything. The awful part of this being that oaths and vows were filled with religious words that gave the perception that one was so godly and so devout, while the oath itself really intended to deceive the one it's being made to. So while these things are sacred, they became trivial. While they were intended to carry a lot of weight, they were really seen among the scribes and Pharisees as things that were small and carried little weight. They really, I think, were used because everybody knew you can't trust the word of another. You have to then bring in some kind of sacred religiosity, divine oath or vow to give your word some kind of validity. This is the teaching that Jesus has in his sights, that he comes to expose, that he comes to address and correct. So we've seen their perversion. Our second heading is the rest of the passage, verse 34 to 37, the correction of Christ. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So in the strongest language available to him, Jesus corrects all this falseness by instructing others to not take oaths at all. You've heard that it was said, these things I say to you, don't do this at all. Now some have believed down through the history of the church that this is a comprehensive rejection of every kind of oath and every kind of vow, making them off limits and out of bounds for Christians. Christians should have simple language, not any type of ceremonial, religious kind of language making you do this or that. But then you read the rest of even the Gospel of Matthew, the rest of the New Testament, where Jesus himself makes oaths, where Paul will make oaths, and many, many others will make vows of various kinds throughout the rest of the Scriptures. God himself even does this throughout the whole Bible, accommodating, I think, displaying himself to us in a way we can understand. But despite these clear facts, throughout church history, some have still upheld that all oaths and vows ought to be rejected by Christians. The chief example of this was in the Reformation days, a little bit after Luther and Calvin, the figures that are well known and popular. There came a movement called the Anabaptists. They saw the errors of Rome, and they were like, no. Then they saw the Reformers react initially, and to them they said, no. And they did their own overreaction, and in their reaction, they said, no vows ever. No oaths at all. The famous example is George Fox. Does anyone know George Fox? You heard of George Fox? He was the founder of the Quakers, the Quaker movement. He was once thrown into prison for refusing. He'd come to court to bear testimony in a various case. They brought him up on the stand, and he refused to swear on the Bible to tell the truth because he said, that book tells me not to swear or make an oath. And the judge was just like, go to jail. Really? Jail. Off to jail for you. While that kind of steadfast conviction is admirable, he overreacted to the teaching of the Lord. So we do not follow suit because Jesus had a particular kind of oath-making or vow-making that he had in his sights. We've seen this a little bit in verse 33, but notice here in verse 34 and on, especially verse 34 to 36, he describes what they were doing in greater detail. He said the kind of oaths and vows that he has in view are the kind that swear by heaven, by earth, by Jerusalem, or one's own head or self. Those are the examples of oaths that were being abused in his own day. Now, we already said that in the Old Testament, oaths and vows are encouraged for rare, solemn, and serious occasions, but that the people began using them for anything and everything. So by stating these four examples here in Matthew 5, Jesus is further exposing their sinful speech. So you see the scribes, the Pharisees, Jews in general, if they desired to make themselves seem or to be seen as religious or devout or holy or reverent, in their common speech, whether with each other or with others outside their fold, they would employ the use of oaths and vows to bring a kind of seriousness to their speech. So they'd be talking, and all of a sudden they'd be like, I swear the life of Israel, or the existence of the kings of old. They would use language like this to bring a kind of weightiness to their talk. Yet notice, in these examples, especially here, what's missing? The divine name. The divine name. So by intentionally omitting God's name, they believed that they were free to make an oath or a vow about anything in life without the fear of guilt. Because all those Old Testament passages that we read all said swearing falsely on my name. So they're like, if we don't use the name, it can't be false. This was a sham. It was hollow. It was sin. So Jesus says, don't do this at all. He then explains each one, how it still brings God into it and incurs guilt, even if God's name isn't mentioned. So those that swore by heaven seem to forget. Jesus says that heaven is God's throne. Those that swore by the earth seem to forget, Jesus says, that the earth is God's footstool. And those that swore by Jerusalem seem to forget, Jesus said, this is the city of God's great kings of old. And those that swore by their own heads seem to forget that they were mere men who didn't really have the power to change anything in life, let alone a hair on your head. Later on in Matthew 23, the famous chapter where Jesus lays into the Pharisees even more severely than he's already doing, he extends these images to more of the language that they were using, saying you shouldn't even swear on the temple, the gold in the temple, the altar in the temple, or the offering on the altar. So the options that these scribes and Pharisees used to avoid the divine name, but use all these other religious words, were abundant, and they used them all. Jesus says, don't do this at all. This language is ironic, what they used. They intentionally leave out God's name, but what do they put in its place in all these oaths and vows? The works of God's own hands. This is Jesus' point. To make an oath or a vow like this is to make an oath or vow with God in view, even if you never mention him at all. And this was the issue, right? Again and again, this is the issue. Even if you don't physically or audibly cross these lines, you're still crossing them in your heart. This is the Sermon on the Mount. Get rid of this physical religion that you've got, this outward external show of devout faith, and look within. God is above all things. God is over all things. He owns all things. He hears all things. He knows all things. Nothing is hidden from God. Everything we do, therefore, is done before the face of God. And so if everything is done before the face of God, then all we do in life ought to be considered sacred. That's what they missed. Because God is God, God is over everything. There is nothing about their lives or your lives or my life that God is absent from. Therefore, everything that we do, God is in it, whether we willingly recognize this or not. Jesus' point about all these Old Testament passages about oaths and vows, this is what the law and the prophets were aiming at the entire time. Not just the bare external obedience, religious look or appearance of things, but the heart of the oath or vow maker. So what does Jesus say? Look at verse 37. Let what you say be simply yes or no, anything more than this comes from evil. There's an option of translation there with evil, similar to in the Lord's Prayer. This could either be from evil or from the evil one, or of the evil one, which theologically it's hard to separate evil from the evil one. So we could just say yes. Anything more than just yes or no is of the evil one, and it is therefore evil. So let your speech just be yes or no. This is a call for simple, straightforward truthfulness in all speech. We who follow Jesus, the kingdom of Christ is filled with people whose words are characterized by integrity and by honesty. We follow him who is himself the truth. So all our speech ought to be true. So true that no formal oath or vow or pompous show of religiosity is needed in order to get people to trust us. This is not teaching that Christians are never to take vows, never to make oaths. Again, vows exist in the New and Old Testament, and vows exist in the world around us. You live long enough, you can't really avoid vows or oaths. They are necessary for marriage, for military service, for holding public office, for testifying in court, and more. Negatively speaking, oaths and vows exist in the world because the world is deceptive, careless, and full of lies. Something really is needed to be added to our nature, to our speech, because of our nature, because of how deceitful we are. We naturally don't take each other at our word because we know each other. This is human life in the world. So an oath or vow needs to be added for trust to come in. That's a negative way to look at it. Positively, oaths and vows exist in the world to remind us of those moments that are rare in life, that are serious, solemn, sobering, where we must remember the level of commitment that's being made. So Christians in the world can and should make vows and oaths when necessary, but even though they may be rare, they must always be serious and solemn. And when they are done, simplicity is best. Anything else that gets added to this, Jesus says, is evil. Why add to speech? Do you have something to cover up? Let your yes be yes and your no, no. As I was thinking about this past week, one of those rare pastoral moments happened where I'm like, I look back on like Friday, Saturday. This is while I'm at the baseball field. I'm being the first base coach. I'm thinking about these things. I have no idea what's going on in the game at this moment. Your mind wanders throughout the day, and I'm like, man, I started Monday, Tuesday, like, what am I going to tell them? It happens a lot. And then I'm studying, I'm praying, I'm studying, I'm praying, I'm thinking, I'm writing, I'm deleting, I'm rewriting, I'm doing all these things, more praying, more studying. Then all of a sudden I get to Saturday, and a lot's written, but I'm like, I'll probably throw half of that away. Got to restart. Thinking all these things, then I'm like, man, how relevant is this text? I began the week not knowing its relevance, lived this past week, got to Saturday and was like, wow, we just came through an election season that was and still is characterized by deception, embellishment, overreaction, lies, deceit, corruption, Free speech is in view all over the place. Both sides now have their idea of what safe speech is. And yet here is our text telling us what our speech ought to look like in the kingdom, how different it is from the world. It's far too easy for us to point a finger at all the politicians and call them out for their sinful speech. Far too easy for us to do that. We need to see that in verse 33 to 37, Jesus is calling everyone out who has a tongue. That's who's in view. If you have a tongue, if you're able to speak, you're in Jesus' sights. In verse 33 to 37. We too overreact. We too embellish. We too lie, deceive, cheat, make empty promises, dodge this or that, make excuses, state half-truths, and at times we even use God's very name in our lies and deception. I mean, think of Peter. Peter's denials. In Matthew 26, just a few chapters after this, we find the description of Peter's 3 denials of Jesus. The first denial was very simple. A servant girl recognized him and said, "Weren't you with Jesus?" And Peter responded, "I don't know what you mean." Very political answer of him. No oath, no vow was there. Definitely a lie. 9th commandment broken. It gets worse. The second denial is worse. Another girl recognizes him, didn't come to Peter, but told some folks nearby. And Peter heard this. Hey, that guy, he was with Jesus. The one being flogged now, the one who was just arrested, that guy was with him. Remember? Peter responded this time, Matthew 26 says, with an oath, saying, "I do not know the man." Which means that's not all he said. He had to say something like, "I swear to God, I've never met the man." Now he's not just lying, not just breaking the 9th commandment, but now he's taking the Lord's name in vain. 3rd commandment, breaking all the oaths and vows, passages 2. The third denial, though, is worst of all. This was a bit later, not quite sure how long after this happened, but his accent betrayed him. As he's talking, people know dialogues and nuances with accent and emphasis and language, and so a group nearby was like, "Are you a Galilean?" Jesus was a Galilean. You're with Jesus, aren't you? You know him. Are you one of the 12? Matthew 26 says, invoking a curse on himself, he said, "I do not know the man." Which means he said more than "I do not know the man." Not just lying, not just an oath, but now it's a curse too. "I swear to God, I don't know him. God is my witness. If I'm lying, he will strike me dead. He will cover me with sores from head to toe." Some kind of curse was present. We don't hear the curse. He lies. He adds an oath to his lie. He lies again with an oath and a curse. This is cultural language at its finest. This is what we do. And so, no wonder After the rooster crowed, we read next that Peter ran off by himself and wept bitterly. None of us are above this, church. However you swear, not cursing with profanity, but however you swear in daily life, I swear to God, I swear on my mother's grave, over my dead body. Why are you embellishing? Almost the presence of such an oath or vow makes me not believe you. You seem like a huckster trying to sell me a used car. That's what that signifies. Jesus is saying, you're displaying your untruthful, dishonest heart. We need to own the sinfulness of our speech. We need to repent of it, turn from it, and endeavor after a higher, holier, simpler speech. It's one of those moments where less is more, right? Sometimes we think, like, in order to become like a better Christian, like we just got to add this, add that. All of a sudden we have a million things that we're trying to remember to do every day. When here is Jesus saying, concerning our speech, the simpler, more honest and straightforward you are, the godlier your speech is. That's what his people are characterized by. Not this pompous show of devout, godly religiosity that people might think is true or might not think is true, but simple, straightforward speech. Yes. No. Next question. But lest we leave here thinking this is just correction time, we need to remember the remedy here is far deeper than just the tongue, right? The remedy is not just trying to fix our speech or even make more rules about our speech. Jesus said yes, yes, no, no. So if you ask me, hey, is your fantasy football team set? Yes. And then you're sitting at lunch like, I can't say anything else. I don't know what to do. I have rules now I got to abide by. This is not what's in view. The remedy lies deeper in the heart. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So church, if your heart doesn't treasure Christ, your mouth will not honor Christ. If your heart doesn't treasure the Lord, love the Lord, make much of the Lord privately, you will not publicly, or it might be a sham, you will not publicly honor the Lord. If we want to be people who speak beautifully, we need to be people who see the beauty of Christ. So there's hope. We can always begin again. We can start anew. We can return to Jesus, labor to see him, who he is, what he has done, what he has promised still to do, and seeing him, recognize that he is the most beautiful person in existence, over all existence. When we see him, our hearts will be filled up with a stout satisfaction, and it will lead to an abundance within that will pour forth from the lips. You can't help but talk about what you love. If you love the Lord, you will talk about the Lord. What a thing it would be if Christians around the world endeavored to become more of this. So, church, this could change everything about your life. This is one of those passages that might seem distant at first, but once you get the spirit of it, this might change everything about your life. If your heart treasures Christ, your mouth will honor Christ.